Hello and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm here with my good friend Michael Reccia and Jane, his life partner. Hello Jane, nice to see you. This is one of your rare appearances.
It is, yes.
Okay, well, it's lovely to see you here. And I know you're as keen as I am today to be listening to Michael telling us a story. Does he tell you bedtime stories?
That will be
All
telling.
the time.
So this is out of the book, Many Voices, One Mission. And this book is a compendium of channelings that came through from various guides of Michael's that Jane put together. And this one came out quite a while before the book, Your Life After Death, and gave a summary, literally, of what happens in story form. And it's a wonderful story. It really is a wonderful story. And so Michael is going to read that story today. And so I'll happily hand over to Michael now.
Thank you, Tony.
And I'm going to relax and enjoy the story for another time.
And the story is told by the Persian gentleman, one of the oldest connections I have to Joseph and his soul group. The Persian gentleman has been with me for all my life and before my life, before this particular life. So he begins the communication. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Jane. And good morning, Molly. Now, this is a greeting to our spaniel, once described by Silver Star, another of our guides, as the most stubborn dog that ever incarnated. And it is a good morning to talk to you because there is a very strong link between the earth plane and my plane, which I knew about in advance, and which is why I said specifically that I would come to you on this particular Saturday. The day has been arranged so that I can bring this information through early in the morning, when most people are asleep, which is important because when they get up, their thoughts spill out into the atmosphere and pollute the vibration of communication, making it more difficult for us to work. I wish to talk about enrollment into the spiritual realms, although that is not strictly the correct term, as all souls come from and go back to that dimension. And I want to consider things from the point of view of the ordinary man or woman. So, let us imagine that we are with a Mr. Johnson, who has lived what may be described as an average life. He has held down an average job with average earnings. He is married with 2 children and lives in an average type of house. His father is still alive, but his mother has passed on to the spirit worlds, or, as he thinks, has died and no longer exists. Mr. Johnson has been a worrier all his life, and over the last few months has experienced a tightness across his chest as a result of his anxiety. On this particular morning, he sets off to work in his average car, but doesn't actually arrive there, because as he crosses the bridge linking the residential side of the town to the area where he works, he suddenly feels a severe pain in his chest, which he clutches as he tries to keep his car on the road. The pain passes, and he thinks, thank goodness for that. I thought for a moment I was having a heart attack, but it must just have been indigestion. He continues to drive towards work, or so he thinks, and suddenly becomes aware of someone sitting in the passenger seat. Looking across, he sees a man who seems strangely familiar to him, not because he is a family member, but because this spirit has been visiting Mr. Johnson in his sleep for several months, and is one of those people who take the departed across to the higher side of life. His passenger has known, because of the spiritual records available to him concerning Mr. Johnson, the precise time at which he will die. He therefore looks familiar to Mr. Johnson, and this feeling of familiarity is important to allow Mr. Johnson to feel comfortable with this unexpected visitor. He keeps on driving and arrives at work, or so he thinks. And both he and the gentleman get out of the car and go into Mr. Johnson's office. Mr. Johnson thinks it must be April Fool's Day because nobody is taking any notice of him. He has never been a very popular member of the office, but today, because he cannot make anyone talk to him, he can only assume that they have sent him to Coventry as a joke. He walks over to his desk, muttering under his breath that he detests this type of practical joke, and his companion stands at his side as Mr. Johnson tries to switch on the computer, but it won't respond. For some reason, he can't seem to grasp the mouse or work the keyboard, and he becomes increasingly frustrated. He sits at his desk until 11's, when the tea and coffee are brought around, but nobody offers him a cup or even acknowledges him. Feeling that this has gone beyond a joke, Mr. Johnson stands up and begins to shout at them, "I'm just not having this. This is no way to treat me." But no one takes any notice of him except the man who is standing beside him. At this point, Mr. Johnson asks him, "Who are you anyway?" And the man replies, "Doesn't it occur to you that something is different about today? These people are not ignoring you as a joke, but because they are not aware of you. Because from their point of view, you are not in the room." "What do you mean, not in the room?" asks Mr. Johnson. "I am sitting at my desk." To which the man replies, "Only in thought, because, in effect, when you felt the pain in your chest, you passed over and died." Mr. Johnson denies this, saying, "That is absolute nonsense. I am here at work." The man then invites him to try to pick up someone's coffee cup. So Mr. Johnson goes around the room trying to pick up the cups, but he can't because his hand passes straight through them. The man then invites him to try hitting someone to get their attention. So Mr. Johnson walks over to a young office boy and tries to tap him on the shoulder. And whilst the boy shudders, as if someone has walked over his grave, it's clear that he doesn't feel or see Mr. Johnson. The man then says, "You'd better sit down because you made a transition this morning. You had a heart attack whilst you were in your car. It was time for you to come home. And you had better forget the office because it is no longer of use to you." "But what about my wife and children?" asked Mr. Johnson, who then, at the speed of thought, finds himself back at home, where his wife is arranging flowers in a vase. He tries desperately to talk to her, but she can't see him and doesn't react. Instantly, he is with his eldest daughter, who also works in an office, and he takes her by the shoulders, but she can't see him either. In the next moment, he is with his youngest daughter in a lecture at college, and, as he stands right in front of her, he realizes that not only can she not see him, but neither can anyone else around him. Suddenly, in the corner of the room, a brilliant light appears, and the room grows dim. His companion beckons to him, saying, "Please, follow me into the light, into the next stage of your existence." Mr. Johnson feels drawn towards the light because there is a warmth to it and a love that he has never felt before. It is rather like being under anesthetic because he forgets about his wife, forgets about his daughters, forgets about his office job, forgets about his car, forgets about his house, and forgets everything else that seemed so important to him this morning, and follows the man through into the light. The light surrounds him, and he cannot see anything from him for a few minutes, only the light. Then, as it subsides, he finds himself in a village that is just like a village on earth, with walls, trees, houses, and roads, although there aren't any people or cars. Mr. Johnson says to the man who is still standing next to him, "I thought you said I was dead." "If I am, this is very strange, a very strange heaven." To which the man replies, "This is an initiation point, somewhere that will seem familiar to you. Come. There is a place where you can stay for a little while." Mr. Johnson follows him through the door of a rather pleasant house, and there, sitting in the living room, is his mother. He doesn't recognize her at first and wonders who the young lady with the dark hair sitting on the settee is. His mother then explains that she needs to adjust her appearance for him. So she closes her eyes, thinks for a moment, and suddenly she is just as Mr. Johnson remembers her, that frail old lady who was in a hospital bed for a few months before she passed over. He is shocked because this is not some apparition of his mother, but his mother in the flesh, just as she was. She gets up and they embrace, and there is a tearful reunion. Then he sits down and she says, "You had better have some tea and biscuits because you don't look too well." Mr. Johnson agrees that he would like something to eat, and instantly there appears on his knee a tray with a cup of tea on it and a plate of biscuits. He doesn't question how they got there, and the tea tastes better than any tea he has ever tasted before, and the biscuits are just divine. He asks what his mother is doing here, and she says, "I have come to make you feel comfortable during this transitional period. If you recall, I was a little bit psychic when I was on Earth, and sometimes said strange things that made people a bit wary of me. However, being that way prepared me for this place. So when I came across, I didn't see this village at all, but went straight to the next stage, which you will also see in a little while. I knew that you would have a more difficult time of it because you never believed in an afterlife, simply believing that when you were dead, you were dead. So your mind, in conjunction with the people who care for you here, has constructed the image of this village around you. It is the type of place that you would have liked to have retired to. You often talked about it, and here it is. It is real for as long as you wish it to be real, until you feel comfortable with your transition. I will come back and talk to you again, but for now, I would like you to rest for a little while." Suddenly she disappears, and the man who has been with him all this time reassures him she will come back, so don't fret about her leaving. You cannot lose anybody on this side, and you will see her again. You do need to rest, so wouldn't you like to go through to the bedroom? He shows him through to a very pleasant little bedroom with a single bed in it. Mr. Johnson does feel tired, so lies down on the bed, and the instant his head touches the pillow, he falls asleep. When he awakens, he sees another gentleman in a very brightly coloured robe standing next to his companion. There is also another being present, surrounded by gold and silver light, who Mr. Johnson has difficulty seeing, as though he is only half there. Remembering that he has died, Mr. Johnson sits up and asks what he is supposed to do now. The gentleman in the coloured robe says, "Come with me, please, Mr. Johnson," and takes him out of his house and down the road to what looks like a village boundary. And through the misty boundary, Mr. Johnson can see quite a different scene. There are still houses, trees and hills, but everything seems more vibrant. The people on that side of the barrier are also in coloured robes and are relaxing, with some sitting on benches and talking, and others reading. This dimension seems far more ethereal than his village. The sky has coloured streams of light in it, rather like the aurora borealis on Earth, but far more beautiful. As he looks at the buildings, they appear to change. Sometimes they look traditional, and at other times they seem to be made out of light, as though he is looking at the inner as well as the outer structure of them. The being in the coloured robes turns to him and says, "Mr. Johnson, this is the next stage in your journey, but you cannot actually get there yet because you have a lot of pollution around you from the earth plane. You bought into it so heavily that we have to firstly convince you that you are still alive, and secondly, acclimatize you to this land I am showing you, which is the next stage and somewhere you will live for some time. What we would like you to do now is to go back to your house, and the gentleman who came for you, whose job it is to take people over to the spirit realms, will answer any questions you may have over the next few days, or at least they will seem to you like days. Then, when you realize where you are, that you are a spirit, and that you cannot die, you can go through this barrier, and we can introduce you to life on the other side of it." Mr. Johnson looks at the man in the robe and sees the other being in silver and gold next to him, who seems much taller than the other two and looks like an angel, although he can only see part of him. Instinctively, he knows that the gentleman in the coloured robe is receiving instructions from the angel, and can see him pause before he speaks, as though he is considering the angel's words. So Mr. Johnson goes back to the house that has been allocated to him, accompanied by the man who came to take him across, and over the next few days they have long discussions about life, about death, and about God. Mr. Johnson's memory of his family returns, and he's quite upset, but he is allowed to see them. It is as though he is able to look into a corner of his bedroom and see right into his old house, where he can see his wife and daughters are distressed because they are grieving over him. He is allowed to visit through the image in the corner of the room a chapel of rest, where there is an open coffin in which lies his physical body. As he accesses these images, time seems to be different to what he was used to on earth, because he witnesses a rapid succession of scenes, but also seems to be a part of them. One minute he is in the chapel of rest. The next he is at his funeral service. Then, quickly, his wife and daughters seem to be far happier, as though a lot of time has passed and they have already forgotten him. His companion reassures him. They haven't forgotten you, but the passage of time on earth and what you perceive as time here is different. We allow many people to go back to their own funeral because they need that sense of closure and conclusion to their earthly life. Some souls move straight on without a backward glance, but they are mostly people who have gained some spiritual insight during their physical lives. He then asks Mr. Johnson how he feels, to which Mr. Johnson replies, "I'm not sure, but I do know that I want to move on now. I feel as though I am no longer part of the earth, and that I am ready to step through that barrier into the next land, if that is okay." At that point, the spirit in the coloured robe appears, together with the angel, and they take Mr. Johnson to the barrier. He steps through the mist, and, as he looks back, the village he has been living in for goodness knows how long, because you lose track of days and nights here, disappears, as though it has simply been an illusion. And the mist vanishes too, so that he is now completely in a very different land. One of the things he first notices is a park where children in coloured robes are playing and seem blissfully happy. Some of them are with people he assumes to be their parents, although they actually look too young to be parents, and some are being cared for by beings of light, people in very luminous robes. The children are creating images, such as fairy castles, between themselves in the air, which seem quite real, until they think of something else, at which point the images disappear. Mr. Johnson notes that around some of the children there are elementals, each within its own little sphere of colour, but these seem real and not just creations of their imagination, and the children are quite accepting of their presence. Mr. Johnson sits on a bench and watches the children for he doesn't know how long. He then turns his attention to another part of the landscape and sees a group of people sitting on the grass listening to a lecture. Mr. Johnson can hear the speaker's voice, but is fascinated because he can also see colours around the people and knows what each individual is thinking and feeling. He can sense that the person delivering the lecture is pure and is sending out love to the group around him that he earnestly desires to teach. The man in coloured robes who took him through the barrier then approaches and says, "Please say goodbye now to your companion who has been with you since you passed over." Mr. Johnson is a little upset. "I don't understand. He is the only friend I have here and the only person I know." The companion promises to come back and visit from time to time, but has a very busy schedule with many more people about to make their transition. He explains that Mr. Johnson is now in the care and keeping of the gentleman in coloured robes, who was, in fact, Mr. Johnson's guide whilst on earth. "What do you mean by guide?" asks Mr. Johnson, to which his companion replies, "Well, he was someone who, at intervals during your life, fed you information through your intuition, so that you would, hopefully, make the right decisions for the progress of your soul. Do you not recognize him?" Mr. Johnson looks at the man in the coloured robes, who is of a different race to Mr. Johnson, but there is a recognition, a feeling as though he is remembering a member of his family from long ago. The companion disappears, and, as always, he is aware of the presence of the higher angelic spirit around the person whom he now knows was his guide. The man in coloured robes invites Mr. Johnson to walk with him, and suddenly the landscape changes again. He is strolling through a beautiful park with tree-lined avenues, and he feels under his feet a very soft yet supportive ground unlike anything he has ever experienced before. He feels a great harmony from the grass and the trees, as though these things are alive and are sending love to him. He feels, for the first time in his life, completely at ease. He has no fear and no anxiety for the future. He is completely at one with this place and completely at peace. And it is a wondrous feeling. The robed gentleman invites Mr. Johnson to sit on a bench, which supports him perfectly, as though it is shaped to his back. He sits looking out across the park and can see people in the distance walking amongst the beautiful flowers. And as they put their hands out towards them, the petals respond by changing colour. He notices that the people's robes also change colour from minute to minute, as some of the shades within them become stronger and then diminish as other colours rise to the surface. It is as though their robes are alive. There is a peace and purpose here with no hurry, and certainly none of the stress that caused his heart attack. The gentleman in the coloured robe says, "I suppose you are wondering what happens next." Well, this is a kind of way station where people come to be acclimatized. You may think that your village was such a station, but that was the initial phase and a construct from your own thoughts and beliefs. This place is as real as any other and is created by the communal thoughts of many people. It is one of the steps of evolution you must pass through in order to reach the higher planes. "What do you mean by higher planes?" asked Mr. Johnson. "Well," replies his guide, "heaven is not a static place. God's creation expresses itself through movement and change, and the movement with spirits is always upwards, and always as a wish to be closer to God. But for the moment you should stay here, and have no choice but to stay here, because your vibrations will not allow you to go anywhere else." "What are these other heavens like?" "This place is so amazing. I could stay here forever. But what are the other places like?" asks Mr. Johnson. The gentleman in the robes replies, "Concentrate and look ahead of you, and you will see." Mr. Johnson then has a wondrous vision as his guide takes his hand to transfer energy to him. And in front of him, through a hole in the landscape, Mr. Johnson can see the most awe-inspiring places, as though he is looking at a child's pop-up book, which, when opened, displays different layers of images stretching both backwards and upwards. It is as though he is looking at landscape after landscape leading upwards into a brilliant light. The places are indescribably beautiful. In the first landscape, he can see people talking without moving their lips, defying gravity and flying, and creating things with light. On the second ascending level, he can see people who appear to be creating a landscape around themselves with beautiful trees and flowers. Some of these people are also investigating their inner selves or expressing themselves through music by playing instruments they may not have been able to play whilst on earth. Others are creating great works of art and sculpture. Some are writing books without applying pen to paper, but by simply thinking the words onto the page in bubbles that appear above their heads. Here there is a great sense of learning, creation, and artistry. Above this level, you can see people in increasingly luminous robes indulging in activities that are beyond his comprehension. And above that, there seems to be a plane made entirely of crystal and light. Above that, there is an ethereal plane that almost looks transparent from his point of view. And above that, a celestial light that bathes and feeds all these landscapes he is observing. These places are so wondrous that naturally Mr. Johnson wants to be a part of them. And so he asks the man in robes, "How do I get to be there?" His guide replies, "Well, there are many ways to reach the higher spheres. An absolute last resort, one that we do not recommend at all, but one that is available as a last resort if you refuse to consider any of our other suggestions, is the option of incarnating again on the earth plane. But we are not at that stage yet with you. We hope and pray that that option will be avoided, and we strongly advise that you would be extremely unwise to consider it. You can stay here for as long as you wish to, and through your own work and discovery of the various aspects of your soul, you can reach those landscapes. It is entirely up to you. There will be a time a few days from now when you will review your life on earth, but for now, we would like you to rest. And now, I think you will recognize these people who are coming to meet you.
Michael, you stopped on a cliffhanger.
We've stopped on a cliffhanger, Tony. Yes. Time for tea and biscuits.
Do I have to wait a week now to find out what happens?
I think so. Yes.
So thank you for that, Michael, and thank you to the viewers. We've split this story into two halves, and that was the first half. The next half will be in a week's time, and we do hope that you'll come to hear these words of wisdom. Michael, I know how difficult it was to read that word perfect as you did. Amazing.
Very kind.
And I look forward to a week from now, meeting up, and we can continue the story. Thank you as well for this wonderful book, Jane. This is another of the books, Many Voices, One Mission, that you must get. It's so amazing. All the different guides come up with their own point of view from such an evolved level. So, from me, from Michael, and from Jane, thank you for watching, and God bless.
God bless and thank you.